She had nothing left but pride until he offered her a home. The first frost of October had already turned the fence posts silver. Emily Whitfield walked the last mile to the Ashford Ranch on foot. Her carpet bag grew heavier with every step. She had only $3 left in her pocket. She had not planned to end up here. 2 weeks ago, she had been the school teacher of Pine Hollow. People respected her, even if she was not rich. Now the schoolhouse was closed. Her room above the store was rented to someone else. The only work left in 100 miles of Wyoming belonged to a widowed rancher. People in town called him too hard-hearted to marry again. She did not know that Michael Ashford would open his gate to her that night. She did not know he would offer her a marriage in name only. She did not know that pride, the one thing she had left, was about to be tested harder than ever before. 3 weeks earlier, Emily had stood before the Pine Hollow School Board. They explained, gently but firmly, that the town could no longer pay her salary. The railroad had not come through yet. Tax money was low. The children would have to wait to learn their letters, one man said, not quite meeting her eyes. By the next Tuesday, her room was rented to another family. By Thursday, a letter arrived from Samuel Reed, the man she had planned to marry. In his familiar handwriting, he explained that a school teacher without a school was no longer a good match for a man building a business in Cheyenne. Emily read the letter 4 times before she let herself cry. Just once, at the kitchen table of a room that was no longer hers. Samuel had once been kind. He used to walk her home from church suppers and tell her she had the finest mind in the territory. But it seemed a fine mind mattered less than money when a man was choosing a wife for city society. Her family's farm in Illinois had been sold 2 winters before, after her father died and left debts behind. Her mother passed away within the year, worn down by grief and hard work. There was no home to return to, no family name to lean on, no money to speak of. Just a carpet bag, $3 silver, and a Wyoming winter closing in. She had exactly one thing left that no one could take from her, the choice to keep trying, and pride, the stubborn kind that kept her chin up, even with worn-through boots. Before this was over, she would have to decide whether pride was worth more than a warm house and a full table. She did not yet know her answer. Emily spent 2 nights at the boarding house in Bitter Creek before her money ran too low to stay a third. Mrs. Doyle, the kind woman who ran the boarding house, gently suggested that Emily try one of the large ranches nearby. They might need help with housekeeping or mending. "There's the Ashford place," Mrs. Doyle said, wiping her counter. "Big ranch, north of town. The man lost his wife 2 years back. Never married again. He might need a housekeeper, though I can't say he's easy to work for." It was not much to go on, but it was the only lead Emily had. She set out that morning on foot. The sky grew darker by the hour. She told herself the walk would take 3 hours, then 4. Then she stopped telling herself anything at all as the wind picked up and snow began to fall. By the time the Ashford gate came into view, she had stopped believing she would make it anywhere. The storm was not going to let her make a polite inquiry about housework. It was going to bury her in snow if she didn't find shelter soon. The Ashford Ranch rose out of the gray afternoon like something from a story she used to tell her students. 2 stories of timber, glowing windows, smoke curling from the chimney. It looked like everything she had lost, and everything she had never had. She was still standing at the gate, snow gathering on her shoulders, when the door opened. Michael Ashford filled the frame. "You lost, miss?" His voice was deep and unhurried. "The storm came up sudden," she said. It was true, if not the whole truth. He studied her. The thin coat, the carpet bag, the way she stood as if bracing for a blow. "You're the school teacher," he said. It was not a question. The position was eliminated, Emily said, lifting her chin, along with the school. Michael nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he already suspected. Storm's getting worse. Coffee's on the stove. House is warm. He paused. "You got somewhere else to be?" It was. Emily would realize later, the kindest question anyone had asked her in a month. It assumed nothing, and pitied nothing. It simply left the door open. Not particularly, she admitted. Something in her chest, some knot she had carried since Tuesday, loosened slightly. "Then come in before we both turn to ice," Michael said, and turned back toward the house without waiting to see if she'd follow. She followed him inside. The house was clean but bare. No flowers, no needlework, nothing soft anywhere. The wood floors were polished, and the staircase curved up like something from a picture book. But there was not a single vase, not a single embroidered cushion. It was a house built by a man managing on his own, not a man truly living. "Boys," Michael called, hanging his hat on a peg. "Come meet our guest." The sound of running feet echoed from deeper in the house. Two small faces appeared around the kitchen doorway. The older boy, maybe 8, had his father's serious jaw. He looked at Emily like she might be here to steal something. The younger one, no older than 5, walked right up to her with a small child's fearless curiosity. "Are you really a teacher?" he asked. "I was," Emily said, kneeling to his height. "Do you like learning things?" "Papa says I have to learn my letters. They're hard." "They're hard at first," she agreed. "But once you know them, they open up whole worlds." The boy, whose name was Eli, nodded seriously, as though this settled something important. His older brother Wyatt said nothing at all, but he was listening. Emily could tell by the way his eyes tracked every word, deciding whether she was a threat or just a stranger passing through a storm. "Boys, back to your supper," Michael said, and they scattered as quickly as they had come. The kitchen was the largest Emily had ever stood in. Michael poured coffee dark as midnight and strong enough to wake the dead. "Storm's getting worse," he said, nodding at the window. "Roads will be impassable by morning." Emily wrapped her cold fingers around the tin cup. She said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not sound like the plea it was. "I heard about the school," Michael said after a moment. "Shame. Children need learning. Not enough to pay for it, it seems." He studied her over the rim of his cup. "What will you do now?" It was the question she had been dreading. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "Look for another position somewhere, I suppose." Where? Such a simple word, but it laid bare the truth of her situation. There were no other teaching jobs within 100 miles, not for a woman alone with no family and no money to travel. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time since Tuesday, her voice cracked. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Emily could hear the wind howling, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the house, one of the boys laughed at something, a bright sound against the storm outside. "I've got a proposition for you," Michael said finally. Emily looked up, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. "I need a wife," he said. "Not for romance, for practical reasons. Someone to keep house, help with the boys, keep hot food on the table. Winter's coming hard, and I can't manage it all alone." Emily stared at him. Sure, she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "A business arrangement," Michael went on, his voice steady, as if discussing the price of cattle. "You need shelter and safety. I need help running this place. We could make it work." "Mr. Ashford, I hardly know you." "What's to know? I'm a decent man. I pay my debts and keep my word. I don't drink to excess, or raise a hand to women or children. I own this land free and clear, and I've got money in the bank." "You'd want for nothing." Emily felt the world tilt around her. Men did not simply propose marriage to women they had known for the length of a coffee cup. "The boys need a mother," Michael continued. "They're good children, but they're running wild without a woman's care. And I need a partner. Someone I can count on." Outside, the wind shrieked. Emily thought of the $3 silver in her pocket, of the long winter ahead, of the very real chance that she might not survive it alone. "It wouldn't be a real marriage," Michael added, as if reading her thoughts. "Separate rooms, separate lives, in many ways. Just two people helping each other through." "Why me?" she finally asked. Michael considered this carefully, without flinching. "You're educated. The boys could use that. You're alone, which means you'd be committed to making this work." He met her eyes directly. "And you're desperate enough to say yes." The plain honesty of it took her breath away. No pretty words, no false promises, just the truth. "I need time to think," Emily said. Michael nodded toward the window, where snow now fell so thick they could barely see the barn. "Storm's not going anywhere," he said. "Neither are you tonight. We can talk more in the morning." He was right, of course. The decision had already been made for her, by wind and weather and circumstance. The only question left was what she would choose to do with it come morning. Michael showed her to a small room on the first floor. Simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. It was better than anything she could afford on her own. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm, and tried to imagine her life in this house. Waking every morning to cook breakfast for a man who barely knew her name. Caring for children who might never accept her as their mother. Living as a stranger in a home that would never truly be hers. But then she thought of the alternative, the cold, the hunger, The very real chance that winter would take her life before spring came again. Pride was a luxury, she told herself. A fine thing to hold on to when a person had food in the pantry and a roof that was truly theirs. She had neither. Sometimes survival was the only choice that mattered. She did not sleep well, but by the time gray morning light found its way through the curtains, she had made her decision. Morning came gray and still, the kind of quiet that only follows a real storm. Emily woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and for one merciful moment, forgot where she was. She found Michael at the window, watching 2 feet of new snow bury the road to town. "Storm's blown itself out," he said, without turning. "Dumped near 2 feet, by the look of it." "I've been thinking about your proposal," Emily said, joining him. "I need to understand what you're really asking. You say the boys need a mother, but what would you expect from me exactly?" Michael leaned against the counter, choosing his words. "The boys need steadiness. Someone to make sure they eat proper meals and stay clean. Someone to teach them their letters and their manners. They've been without a woman's care for 2 years now. And what would you expect from a wife? Someone to manage the household. Make sure there's food and clean clothes. Someone I can depend on when I'm out working the cattle or handling business in town." He paused, studying her face. "Someone who won't run off at the first sign of hardship. And in return, safety. A roof over your head. Food on your plate. Protection. My name, if that matters to you." He said it like they were negotiating the price of grain. "You'd be mistress of this house. The boys would be yours to raise as you see fit." It was a practical arrangement, nothing more. No talk of affection. No mention of love. Emily felt oddly relieved by his directness, even as part of her felt hollow at how businesslike it all was. "Separate rooms," she said, more to confirm than to question. "Separate rooms," Michael agreed. "You'd have your privacy, I'd have mine. Unless," he stopped, then seemed to think better of what he was about to say. "Unless someday we decided different. But that would be a long way off, if ever. And it would be your choice as much as mine." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away. "I'd want to keep teaching," she said suddenly. "The boys, certainly. But others too, if any wanted lessons. The school is closed, but there must be children who could benefit." Michael nodded, unbothered. "House is big enough. We could set up a proper schoolroom upstairs." The easy way he accepted her conditions surprised her. Most men would have objected to their wife working, even at something as respectable as teaching. "If I agreed," Emily said slowly, "when would you want to?" "Soon as the preacher can get here. Roads should clear in a few days." So fast, her entire life, changed in the space of a week. It seemed impossible, and yet here she was, seriously considering it. "Then yes," Emily said quietly. "I'll marry you, Mr. Ashford." Michael put out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Emily shook it. His grip was firm and warm, rough from years of hard work. It felt like sealing a bargain, which she supposed it was. "Welcome to the family, Miss Whitfield," he said. Chapter 11. An old flame's shadow word of the engagement reached town faster than the roads could clear, carried by Mrs. Doyle, who meant no harm by it. 3 days before the wedding, a letter arrived at the ranch addressed to Emily, in handwriting she knew right away. Samuel Reed had heard that his former intended was about to marry one of the wealthiest ranchers in 3 counties. Suddenly, a penniless schoolteacher's prospects looked far more interesting to him than they had a month before. His letter said his earlier one had been written in haste, under pressures he now regretted, and asked her to reconsider what they once had. Emily read it twice at the kitchen table, feeling something between anger and a strange, hollow amusement. The man who had dropped her the moment she became inconvenient now wanted her back the moment she seemed valuable again. She showed the letter to Michael that evening, not entirely sure why she felt the need to. He read it in silence, his jaw tightening slightly. "Do you want to answer him?" he asked, handing it back. "I already have my answer," Emily said. "I gave it 3 days ago, in this kitchen, to you." Something shifted behind Michael's eyes. Relief, perhaps, though he would never have called it that. "You don't owe me an explanation for turning him down." "I'm not offering one," Emily said. "I'm simply telling you the truth. Pride kept me standing through the worst weeks of my life, Mr. Ashford. I won't hand it back to a man who only wants me now that someone else has decided I'm worth having." She burned the letter in the stove that night. If Michael watched her do it with quiet approval, neither of them mentioned it. Reverend Caldwell arrived at the ranch 3 days later, looking like a man who would rather be anywhere else in Wyoming. He sat stiffly in the front parlor, Bible in hand, glancing between Michael and Emily with disapproval. "This is highly irregular," he said, adjusting his glasses. "Marriage is a sacred institution, not a business deal." "With respect, Reverend," Michael said, his voice patient but firm, "the marriage will be legal and binding. The reasons behind it are our own concern." The ceremony itself was brief. Emily found herself repeating words that felt strange on her tongue, promising to honor and cherish a man she had known for less than 2 weeks. When Reverend Caldwell pronounced them husband and wife, Michael's kiss was brief and formal, a bargain sealed rather than a romance begun. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Ashford," said Mrs. Doyle, who had come to witness, beaming despite the Reverend's clear disapproval. Mrs. Ashford. Emily felt the strange new weight of the name settle over her. She was no longer the displaced schoolteacher. She was mistress of one of the largest ranches in the territory, and a stranger in her own marriage. The first weeks passed in small discoveries. Emily learned Michael took his coffee black and strong, that Eli was afraid of thunder, but not blizzards, and that Wyatt had quietly taught himself to read from the labels on canned goods, refusing to admit he needed lessons at all. She learned the kitchen stove had a temperamental damper that needed coaxing, and that the upstairs floorboards creaked in a pattern that could wake the boys if she wasn't careful walking to her room at night. What she did not learn, in those early weeks, was much about the woman whose place she had taken. Rebecca's clothes still hung in the wardrobe. Her hairbrush still sat on the dressing table with a few strands of hair caught in the bristles. But no one spoke of her. It was as though the family had agreed that mentioning the dead would somehow make Emily's presence less real. She found Wyatt one afternoon sitting on the floor of what had once been a nursery, holding a small wooden horse, and staring at a portrait turned to face the wall. "She made this for me," he said, not turning around. "Before Eli was born. She said every boy needed a good horse to ride." Emily stepped carefully into the room, thick with dust. "It's beautiful work. She could make all sorts of things. Toys and quilts." His voice caught. She was making a cradle for the baby that didn't come. The weight of that simple statement settled over Emily. Another baby. Another loss no one had mentioned. Rebecca had died giving birth to Eli, but there had been a baby sister meant to follow 2 years later, and she too had not survived. "I'm sorry," Emily said, sitting on the floor beside him. "That must have been very frightening for you." "Papa cried," Wyatt whispered, as if confessing a terrible secret. "I wasn't supposed to see, but I did." He held her and cried, like the world was ending. Emily thought of Michael as she had come to know him, steady, practical, careful with his feelings, and tried to imagine him broken by grief. The image was almost too painful to picture. "Sometimes even the strongest people need to cry," she said gently. Wyatt finally turned the portrait around, revealing a woman with kind eyes and light brown hair, holding a baby, while a younger Wyatt stood proudly beside her chair. "She looks like someone who gave very good hugs," Emily said. She did. She smelled like bread and lavender, and she always had time to listen. Wyatt's voice was wistful. "Do you think she's watching us from heaven?" "I think if she is," Emily said carefully, "she'd want you and Eli to be happy, to grow up strong and good. But what if she doesn't like that you're here? What if she thinks you're trying to replace her?" The question hit Emily like a blow. The fear she had not even admitted to herself. "I'm not trying to replace your mother," she said firmly. "No one could do that, and I wouldn't want to. But maybe there's room for both of us in your heart. Your mother for the love you'll always carry, and me for whatever new kind of caring we might build together." Wyatt studied her face with eyes too serious for a boy of 8. "You promise you won't leave, even if it gets hard?" "I promise." He seemed to weigh her answer, then carefully set the wooden horse on a shelf where it could watch over the room. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally. "Even if Papa doesn't love you the way he loved Mama, I'm still glad." It was, Emily realized, exactly what she needed to hear. Not a promise of a love she couldn't have, but recognition of the love she could earn. It took the better part of a week to turn the empty upstairs room into a proper schoolroom. Michael brought up a long table and 2 benches from the barn loft, sanding down the rough edges himself in the evenings, while Emily swept out years of dust and hung a chalkboard she had salvaged from the shuttered Pine Hollow school. "You kept it?" Michael asked, surprised, when she unwrapped the board from an old quilt. "I couldn't leave it behind," Emily admitted. "It felt like leaving a piece of myself in that empty building." Word traveled fast that the new Mrs. Ashford intended to teach, and within days, Mrs. Doyle sent word that her niece Sarah, a quiet girl of 9 who had never taken to letters, might benefit from lessons. A neighboring family, the Rileys, asked if their boy Thomas could join as well, since the ride to the nearest schoolhouse in town was too long for a boy of 7. On the first morning, 4 children sat at the long table: Wyatt, Eli, Sarah, and Thomas. Sarah kept her eyes on her hands, answering only in whispers, while Thomas fidgeted and announced that letters were a waste of a good morning that could be spent fishing. Emily did not scold him. She simply asked if he had ever tried to read the label on a feed sack or a letter from someone far away, and watched his interest catch despite himself. Sarah proved the harder case. She could recite her letters perfectly when asked alone, but the moment Emily called on her in front of the others, the girl's voice shrank to nothing. Emily noticed the way Sarah's hands trembled, and remembered, with a pang, how it had felt to stand in front of a room and be measured and found wanting. She began keeping Sarah a few minutes after the others left, working through her letters quietly, without an audience. It took 3 weeks before Sarah read a full sentence aloud without stopping. When she finally did, she looked up at Emily with an expression of pure astonishment, as though she had discovered something no one had told her she was allowed to have. "You did that," Emily told her. "I only showed you the letters. You did the rest." Sarah smiled for the first time since she'd started coming, and from that day on, she sat a little straighter at the long table. Wyatt, for his part, had stopped pretending he already knew everything. Watching Thomas and Sarah struggle and improve seemed to loosen something in him, and one evening Emily caught him quietly helping Eli sound out a word without being asked. "You're a good teacher, you know," Michael said one night, watching her grade slates by lamplight at the kitchen table. "Better than you let on." "I only ever wanted to give children what was taken from me," Emily said, "a place where no one decides they're not worth the trouble." By the time the first snow melted into mud season, word of the little schoolroom at the Ashford Ranch had spread well past the families who attended it. Mothers spoke of it at church socials, not always kindly, but with a grudging respect that even gossip could not entirely smother. Church, 3 weeks after the wedding, was Emily's first real public test. Whispers followed her up the aisle, sharp sounds that carried on the winter air like the hiss of snakes. Inside, the scrutiny only grew. After the service, the congregation gathered for their weekly social hour, and Emily found herself the center of attention she had never wanted. "Mrs. Ashford," one woman said, smiling in a way that did not reach her eyes. "How are you finding married life?" "Quite different from teaching school, I imagine." "Different, yes," Emily replied carefully, "but rewarding. I'm sure it must be. Such a lovely home. And of course, the security that comes with marrying so well." The emphasis on the word security made clear exactly what the woman thought of Emily's reasons for marrying. Other women gathered, drawn by the promise of gossip, comparing Emily unfavorably to Rebecca, testing to see how Emily would react to being measured against a woman she could never equal. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Emily said quietly, refusing to take the bait. Before the talk could sharpen further, a small voice spoke up from behind her. "She's not a stranger," Eli announced, slipping his hand into Emily's. "She's our new mama, and she teaches us letters and knows how to tie sailor knots." The women looked surprised by the boy's honest defense. Emily squeezed his hand gratefully. The tension broke entirely when Wyatt, inspired by his little brother's courage, stepped forward too. "And she's teaching us to read properly," he said. "And she makes Papa smile sometimes. Real smiles, not just polite ones." This last observation seemed to surprise Michael himself, who looked down at his older son with something like wonder. The plain, heartfelt words from 2 young boys carried more weight than all the adult posturing combined, and Emily saw several faces in the crowd soften. By the time they climbed back into the wagon, something had shifted. Wyatt kept glancing at her with something that looked almost like pride. The same stubborn pride Emily herself had carried through every hardship, now reflected back at her in a small boy's eyes. The trouble started with missing cattle. 20 head gone from the north pasture with no broken fence, no wandering tracks, just gone. Then more, from neighboring ranches too. Then word of a well-dressed stranger in town asking oddly specific questions about landholdings, and about the railroad survey. "Someone wants our land," Michael said grimly, once the pieces came together. A group, it seemed, was driving cattle off and scaring ranchers to force a cheap sale before the railroad route was decided. Then one of Michael's most trusted hands, a quiet man named Jake, was shot checking a fence line, not killed, but sent home bleeding as a warning. Emily, who had learned wound care years ago from her mother, cleaned and bandaged him herself at the kitchen table, while Michael watched with something new in his expression, the realization that his practical, convenient wife was far more capable than he had bargained for. "You've got a gift for healing," he said as she worked. "My mother taught me," Emily replied, securing the bandage. "She said every woman should know how to tend wounds. You never know when you'll be the only help around. If trouble comes to this house," Michael told her that night, "I need you to take the boys to the root cellar." "That's not what I meant," Emily said. "I can shoot. My father taught me when I was 12. I know basic medical care, as you saw today. If there's going to be trouble, I want to help, not hide." He looked at her, like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "All right," he said finally. "But if it looks like we can't hold them off, you take the boys and run. Promise me that." "I promise." 3 days after Jake was shot, a stranger rode up to the ranch house in a black coat too fine for cattle country, driving a hired buggy that had clearly never seen mud before. He introduced himself as Vance Whitmore, a land agent, and asked politely if he might have a few minutes of Michael's time. Emily watched from the kitchen window as Michael led the man to the porch rather than inside. She saw the careful, unhurried way Michael stood, arms crossed, the way he always stood when he did not trust someone. "I represent a group of investors with interests in the coming railroad route," Whitmore said, producing a folded paper from his coat. "We'd like to make you a generous offer for this property. More than fair market value, given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be?" Michael asked. Whitmore's smile did not waver. "These are uncertain times for ranchers out here. Cattle going missing. A man shot on his own land. Troubles have a way of following a property until its owner decides to let it go. That sounds less like an offer and more like a threat, Mr. Whitmore." "I'd never suggest such a thing," Whitmore said smoothly. "I'm simply a businessman, pointing out that a fair sale now spares a family a great deal of unpleasantness later. My employer is a patient man, but not an endlessly patient one." Michael took the paper, glanced at the number written on it, and handed it back without comment. "This land isn't for sale. Not now? Not later? You can tell your employer that himself, or I'll be glad to tell him in person." Something flickered across Whitmore's face, the first crack in his polish. "That would be unwise. Mr. Cole doesn't care for being told no." "Then Mr. Cole and I have something in common," Michael said. "Because I don't care for being threatened on my own porch." Whitmore climbed back into his buggy without another word, though he paused at the gate to look back at the house, at the smoke curling from its chimney, the way a man might look at something he intended to return for. That evening, Michael told Emily everything Whitmore had said, watching her face carefully as he did. "He was measuring the house," Emily said slowly, "the way he looked at it, like he was already deciding where he'd put a fence. I noticed the same thing." Michael's jaw was tight. "I want you and the boys ready, starting tonight. If anyone comes to that door who isn't family, I want the shotgun within reach and the boys already knowing where to go." "We've drilled it before," Emily reminded him. "They know." "Drill it again," Michael said. "Whitmore didn't ride all the way out here to be told no and simply accept it. Men like that don't give up. They escalate." He was right to worry. It was only 2 nights later that the gunfire came. Gunfire cracked through the dark, followed by shouting. Emily woke at once, heart pounding, and got both boys down to the root cellar in under a minute, just as she had secretly practiced with them, turning the drill into a game so they would not be frightened. Then the front door splintered. 2 armed men stepped into the hallway and found Emily Ashford standing at the end of it, Michael's shotgun raised and steady in her hands. "This is private property," she said, and her voice did not shake. "You need to leave now." They laughed. They assumed a school teacher would not pull the trigger. They were wrong. One man went down clutching his leg. The other surrendered the moment Michael appeared behind them, weapon drawn, giving him the same choice Emily already had. "Smart choice would be to drop your gun," Michael said quietly. The fight went out of the intruders quickly after that. As Michael tied them up, Emily finally let herself shake, the fear finally catching up with her. "Emily." Michael's voice was soft, wondering. "Are you all right?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "The boys?" "Safe in the root cellar. You could have hidden with them. They're my children too," Emily said simply, and in that moment, something fundamental changed between them. Michael looked at her, not as the practical solution to his household problems, but as his partner, his equal, his wife, in every sense that mattered. In the days after the attack, Something shifted between them, the way ice breaks on a spring river, quietly. Then all at once, Michael started seeking Emily out in the evenings, not to talk about ranch business, but simply to talk. He watched her tend Jake's healing shoulder with something that looked less like gratitude and more like wonder. "When did you start thinking of us as your family?" he asked her one evening. "Really thinking of it that way?" "I'm not sure there was one moment," Emily admitted. "It happened slowly, watching Wyatt succeed with his letters, Eli's face lighting up over a friendship bracelet. Realizing I cared whether your plans for the herd worked out," she paused. "And that night the men broke in. My first thought wasn't for my own safety. It was for keeping them away from you and the boys." Michael's hand found hers. "You're not a solution to a problem anymore, Emily. You're not Rebecca's replacement. You're just you, and I find myself caring about you in ways I never expected to again. I've been thinking about what this marriage was supposed to be," he continued. "What we agreed to." Emily's heart began to race. Was he regretting their arrangement? "It was supposed to be practical," he said. "A business arrangement that served both our needs." "Yes," Emily said quietly. "But somewhere along the way, it became something else, at least for me." "I love the way you listen when I talk about the school," Emily said softly. "I love watching you with the horses, seeing how gentle you are with them despite your strength. And I love the man you've shown yourself to be, not just the practical rancher who offered me a marriage of convenience, but the father who carries his son's pictures in his coat pocket, the husband who defended my honor when he barely knew me." Michael stepped closer, his hand reaching up to cup her cheek. "Emily, I'm not asking you to forget what we agreed to, but if there's room in your heart for something more, there's room," Emily whispered. He kissed her then, not the formal, practical kiss of their wedding day, but the kiss of a man who had found something he thought he had lost for good. Emily melted into it, her hands finding his shoulders, feeling the solid reality of him beneath her palms. From the hallway came the sound of running footsteps, and they sprang apart just as Eli appeared in the doorway, followed closely by Wyatt. "You were kissing," Wyatt said, a slow smile spreading across his face. Emily felt her cheeks flame, but Michael just laughed and ruffled his son's hair. "Indeed we were. Does that mean you really love each other now?" Eli asked, with the directness only a 5-year-old possesses. "Not just married for practical reasons. Real love." Michael and Emily exchanged glances, and she saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. "Yes," Michael said firmly. "Real love." Eli whooped with delight, and launched himself at Emily, wrapping his arms around her waist. Wyatt approached more calmly, but Emily could see the happiness in his expression. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Mama would have wanted Papa to be happy again." The kindness of the statement, coming from a child who had lost so much, brought tears to Emily's eyes. She knelt down and gathered both boys into her arms. "I love you both so very much," she said. Word of the attack, and of how it had ended, spread through Bitter Creek faster than any storm. By the end of the week, wagons began arriving at the ranch, one after another, neighbors bringing lumber to mend the splintered front door, a new hinge, a jar of preserves, and no shortage of curiosity. "Heard you held off 2 armed men with nothing but your husband's shotgun and a steady hand," said Mr. Riley, Thomas's father, hauling a plank off his wagon. "Figured the least we could do was fix your door." Emily, embarrassed by the attention, tried to wave it off as nothing more than doing what needed doing. But the men kept coming, and by afternoon, a half-dozen of them were measuring, sawing, and arguing pleasantly over the best way to rehang the door true. The women arrived soon after, ostensibly to bring food for the workers, though Emily suspected they had come as much to see the schoolteacher-turned-rancher's wife, who had made herself the subject of every conversation in town. She braced herself for the same careful cruelty she had faced at church. Instead, Mrs. Riley pressed a warm loaf of bread into her hands and said simply, "My Thomas tells me you've taught him more in 2 months than he learned in 2 years at the town school. I should have thanked you before now." One by one, the other women offered their own small kindnesses, awkward but sincere, as though they had collectively decided that a woman who would stand between armed men and 2 frightened boys had earned something more than gossip. Even Mrs. Whitfield, whose sharp glances at church Emily still remembered clearly, found her out by the wash line and said, without quite meeting her eyes, "I judged you unfairly, I think. I hope you'll accept my apology, along with this." She held out a small tin of lavender soap. "Rebecca used to make something like it. Thought you might like to have it." Emily took it carefully, understanding the weight of what was being offered. "Thank you," she said. That means more than you know. By evening, the door hung true on its new hinges. The yard was full of laughter and the smell of wood smoke, and Michael found Emily standing at the edge of it all, watching neighbors who had once whispered about her now teaching Wyatt how to properly set a hinge pin. Feels different, doesn't it? He said, coming to stand beside her. It does, Emily agreed. I came to this territory with no one. I didn't expect to end up with all of this. Neither did I, Michael said quietly. Not until you walked up to that gate. 3 weeks later, the territorial marshal arrived to investigate the cattle theft and the attack on the ranch. Marshal Hale was a weathered man in his 50s who listened to their account with patient attention. Railroad speculation, he confirmed, once Michael finished explaining. We've been tracking a group operating across 3 territories. They identify valuable land, then use threats and theft to force owners to sell cheap. What can be done? Michael asked. We've got enough evidence to arrest the men you're holding, and they're talking, hoping for lighter sentences. Seems there's a main organizer working out of Denver who's been buying land options for an Eastern Railroad group. Name of Harrison Cole. He's been asking about your property specifically. Seems he thinks your land is key to the route they want to build. And if I don't want to sell? The marshal's smile was grim. Then they'll keep trying to make you want to. But with what we've got now, we can move on Cole directly. I expect an arrest within the month. That evening, once the marshal and his deputies had gone, Michael found Emily in the kitchen. It's not over yet, he said, but it will be soon. We'll manage whatever comes, Emily said. We, Michael repeated, satisfaction in his voice rather than surprise. I suppose we are building something together, aren't we? Spring came early that year, and with it, a surprise Emily never saw coming. 6 months after their first practical ceremony, Michael arranged the wedding their marriage had never gotten to have. The whole town gathered under the old oak tree in front of the ranch house. Wildflowers picked by Wyatt's own hands, Mrs. Doyle's baskets of food, even a fiddle borrowed from a neighbor for the occasion. Even Mrs. Whitfield, still a little stiff, had come bearing lace for Emily's collar. Reverend Caldwell looked considerably more pleased to be presiding this time. I don't know what to say, Emily whispered, looking around at the gathered crowd. People who had once viewed her with suspicion, now here to celebrate the love she and Michael had found. Say yes, Michael suggested, his own voice rough with emotion. Say you'll marry me again. Properly, this time, not because you needed shelter, or because I needed a housekeeper, but because we choose each other, because we love each other. Emily's answer was to throw her arms around his neck, laughing and crying at once. Yes, she said. Oh yes. When Reverend Caldwell asked if she would take Michael Ashford as her husband, Emily's I will rang out clear and strong, without hesitation, and when Michael made his vows, his voice carried across the yard with the confidence of a man speaking absolute truth. Emily, he said, taking her hands in his, 6 months ago, I offered you a practical arrangement. Today, I'm offering you my heart. You've brought laughter back to this house, wisdom to my children, and love to a man who thought he'd never find it again. I promise to cherish you, to stand by you, and to choose you every day for the rest of my life. Emily's own vows were simpler, but no less heartfelt. Michael, you gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go. But more than that, you gave me a family, a purpose, and a love I never dared to hope for. I promise to be your partner in all things, to love your children as my own, and to help you build a future worthy of the dreams we share. When Reverend Caldwell pronounced them husband and wife this time, Michael's kiss was neither hesitant nor formal. It was the kiss of a man claiming his beloved. Emily responded with the joy of a woman who knew, at last, that she was truly wanted. Not needed, wanted. Emily Ashford had come to that gate with nothing left but her pride and $3 silver, expecting little more than shelter from a storm. What she found instead was a family built not from passion at first sight, but from 2 people choosing, again and again, to stay. She thought often, in the years that followed, of the woman who had stood at that gate, with snow gathering on her shoulders, too proud to beg, and too desperate to walk away. That woman could not have imagined the life waiting for her on the other side of that door. A husband who had learned to smile again. 2 boys who called her mama without a second thought. A home filled with laughter instead of silence. Pride had carried her to that gate. But it was love, patient, unhurried, built one small moment at a time, that had finally given her a home. And sometimes, She came to understand. Those are the love stories worth telling at all. The quiet ones, that grow slowly in the space between necessity and choice. Until one day, you look up and realize you've built a home worth every storm it took to find it. 5 years is not a long time, as such things are measured, but it was long enough to turn the little upstairs schoolroom into a proper one-room schoolhouse of its own, built on a corner of Ashford land, with lumber Michael and the neighboring ranchers had donated between them. It was long enough for Sarah Doyle, no longer quiet, to be the finest reader among a dozen students, and for Thomas Riley to admit, if only to Emily, that letters had turned out to be worth a morning after all. It was long enough for Wyatt, 13 now, and taller than Emily by a head, to take on the serious work of the ranch alongside his father, though he still found time most evenings to sit with the younger children and help them through their lessons the way Emily had once helped him. It was long enough for Eli, 10, to have entirely forgotten a time when he had called her anything other than Mama, and it was long enough for a third child to join the family, a dark-haired, stubborn little girl named Grace, not yet 2 years old, who had inherited her father's serious eyes and her mother's refusal to be told no. Emily and Michael had chosen the name together, quietly, one evening not long before she was born. "I'd like to give her something of Rebecca," Michael had said carefully, watching for Emily's reaction. "Not her name, but something, if that isn't too much to ask." "It isn't too much to ask," Emily had told him. "She gave you Wyatt and Eli. She's part of this family, whether we speak her name or not. I'd like Grace to grow up knowing that." So it was that Grace Ashford's middle name was Rebecca, and on the wall of the schoolroom, alongside the alphabet and a map of the territory, hung the portrait that had once faced a wall in a dusty nursery. Wyatt had asked for it to be moved there himself, so that his mother, he said, could watch the children learn. The town of Bitter Creek had long since stopped whispering about the schoolteacher who had married the widowed rancher for practical reasons. These days, when people spoke of the Ashfords, they spoke of the schoolhouse, and of the rancher's wife who had once stood at his door with a shotgun steady in her hands, and of a marriage that had somehow, against all the cold arithmetic that built it, become one of the great love stories of the territory. On the evening this story properly ends, Emily stood at the kitchen window, watching Michael cross the yard with Grace balanced on his shoulders, laughing at something Wyatt had said, Eli running ahead to swing open the gate for them. It was the same gate she had once stood at, 5 years and a lifetime ago, with nothing left but $3 silver and a pride she had not yet learned to set down. She thought, as she often did in quiet moments like this one, of that other Emily, cold and desperate, and so certain that asking for shelter meant giving up everything that mattered. She had not known then that pride and love were not opposites at all, that a woman could keep her chin up and still let herself be loved, that the home she'd been too proud to hope for had been waiting for her the whole time, on the other side of a gate she only had to walk through. Michael looked up and caught her watching from the window. He smiled, the easy, unguarded smile of a man who had long since stopped being hard-hearted, and lifted Grace's small hand to wave. Emily waved back, and went to open the door before they even reached it.